Well, so much for our countdown video today. Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Krupinski. I'm the marketing director at Michigan Radio. I want to thank you for joining us this evening for our Issues and Ale discussion. If you've never been with us before, Issues and Ale is a discussion series sponsored by Michigan Radio, designed to engage people in conversations about issues and news stories that are happening here in Michigan. So we invite you to sit back with a beer or the beverage of your choice if you are perhaps taking part in dry January, and enjoy our discussion tonight. We are, of course, streaming tonight's event on YouTube and Facebook, and we would love to take your questions throughout the event. So you can do that at any time. Just post your questions in the comment or chat box there on YouTube or Facebook. We'll see those, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can throughout the evening. We do ask that you please try to remain on topic with your questions tonight. So to those in the audience who are sustainers or donors to Michigan Radio in any way, we want to thank you for the investment you make in the work that we do. You know, everything that Michigan Radio does, including events like Issues and Ale, is made possible by your support, and we sincerely thank you for that. So our host tonight is Michigan Radio's resident political junkie, Zoe Clark, and here is Zoe.
Thanks so much, Steve. Hi, everyone. I think there's probably folks out there in the audience who have gotten to come to an in-person one of these. We can't wait to get to do those again. But for now, virtual will have to do. So we are saying hello, even through this screen. I am super, super excited tonight to welcome folks who, I really say this, I think make the state a better place with their work, their journalism, helping to shed light on what's happening in Lansing. So with that, I want to welcome for the first time his first Issues and Ale. So please give a round of applause, even if you're just sitting on your couch in your PJs. Sergio Martinez Beltran covers the state capitol for Bridge, Michigan. Hello, Sergio.
Hey, I'm so excited to be here.
We're so happy to have you. And Emily Lawler, news leader for MLive's statewide team, which really means she is the boss lady, editor extraordinaire for all of the paper's Capitol reporters, as well as having been a Capitol correspondent reporter herself for many, many years. We're super grateful.
Politics and public health, so all the fun stuff right now.
You do all the things that are just joy, and you know, everything is normal and good right now. And finally, I'd like to welcome Rick Pluta, senior Capitol correspondent for Michigan Public Radio Network. I should also note he happens to be my husband and also happens to be in the other room. So just we believe
Zoe got the dining room. I got the panic room.
It doesn't look like a panic room. I don't know why you say that. It needs some art on the wall is what needs to happen. So anyway, welcome to our post-State of the State edition of Issues and Ale. Let's start by just going around really quickly. And Sergio, I want to start with you. What were your main takeaways from this, 27-minute speech last night that the governor delivered from Detroit Diesel outside of Detroit?
Yeah, you know, this was my first State of the State address in the state of Michigan. And I think what was interesting to me was the fact that, I mean, we knew this was going to be one of those speeches where the governor was going to talk about how great she was and how many things she accomplished. At the end of the day, it's the last State of the State of her first term. but I did find it interesting that, I don't know, I didn't feel a lot of emotion or a lot of like excitement. And maybe it is the fact that it was virtual and, there was not a lot of people in the room. It could certainly be that. But I don't know, it felt like a celebration. She was calling for unity, but there was nothing that was too exciting in a way.
You wanted more excitement. Emily Lawler.
I don't know. Yes, I wanted fireworks.
I agree.
Music, that wait music while we were all on hold underneath the speech.
Yeah, no,
Emily,
I
what about
agree.
you?
There could have been more pomp and circumstance. I think that's kind of what you get out of the state at some level. Another thing you get out of being at the State of the State in person is just seeing the reactions of the different lawmakers to her points. So, like, I do remember years where it was like, oh, the Republican lawmakers clapped when she said a certain thing, and you could take that as a pretty reliable indication of their enthusiasm for anything that she mentioned. And conversely, of course, sometimes there is a distinct lack of clapping, or only the Democrats jump up.
Stony silence.
Yeah. So, but in general, like in terms of a vibe check, it really seemed like she was going in this bipartisan direction that, frankly, has not been a hallmark of her governorship in any way, shape, or form.
Rick, all positivity and unicorns and birthday cakes?
I don't know if I'd go that far. Actually, one of the things that was interesting wasn't so much the speech, and I agree with Sergio and Emily that the state of the state, like the State of the Union at the national level, is kind of its own unique thing, with a lot of pomp and circumstance that comes with it. The governor walking down the center aisle of the House chamber, shaking hands along the way, and then getting up and making the pronouncement that the state of the state is something, generally positive. And then there's that moment where everybody gets up and applauds because, well, at the very least they have to. But yeah, this was and this was described after the fact by me, as well as smart people, as kind of the first campaign speech of the governor's reelection effort. And it was almost like, but how could it be anything else? That State of the State addresses tend to be very self-congratulatory, very, look what we can do. But without all of that ceremony that accompanied it, it was very heavy on the self-congratulation without the elements of government that make it kind of bipartisan and multi-partisan.
But we should note, I mean, in terms of self-congratulations, it wasn't just self-reflection about her or the Democratic Party. I mean, you would literally think, like, if you hadn't been paying attention to politics in Michigan, or you're new to Michigan and you heard this speech, you would think that Republicans and this governor had been having just like a swimmingly fabulous time the past 3 years, are just like, what do you want to do? Okay, that sounds great. Let's do it. What is that? What are the politics going into election 2022 for her to push this unity theme? And then I want to get to how the Republicans are going to respond. But Sergio, why politically is she, again, doing unicorns and birthday cakes right now with how things have been with the Republican legislature, when it just plain hasn't been?
Yeah, I think that it has to do with the fact that President Biden is not polling pretty well, right? And we know that at the end of the day, in the midterm elections, usually the party in power in the White House tends to perform pretty bad in the state legislatures and state government. And so I think it's clear that she knows that. I mean, she has a smart team, and she's a smart woman. So it's clear that she knows that, and that she has to play on that unity, making sure. I have this thing that many politicians believe that if you can't convince them, you confuse them. And I think that was part of it, you try to tell them like, hey,
I want that stitched on a pillow.
I know, but I think part of it, it's that. It's like she knows what lies ahead, and she's just trying to play for that right now.
I would say too, like, that's kind of what won her Michigan in 2018, right? Like, if you remember, she had a huge focus on dinner table issues. She had a big bipartisan focus. Her symbol was the Mackinac Bridge, bridging together two peninsulas, and she used it as sort of a metaphor for bridging together two parties. On the campaign trail, she would talk about how, her mom and dad worked for opposite politicians on opposite sides of the aisle, but she had always taken more of a pragmatic approach. That's very much what her message was that won her by a big margin in 2018. And it's hard to go back to that after you've been in the spotlight publicly fighting with Republicans, and not just over COVID. Like, I'll remind you that the 2019 budget was like a knockdown drag out. So it's kind of like we've all hopped in our time machines and we are back on bipartisan page as far as Whitmer's concerned.
Yeah, remember the morning after she won, she held that press conference, and I can't remember exactly what the line was, but it was asked how she was going to work with the legislature, and she said something like, they're not going to have to work for me, or some line that was like a real good quip. And it was basically that, like, they don't work, they're not my employees, they don't work for me. We're going to be at the table together making these decisions. Rick, we should note that Republicans did not give an official response to the speech last night. Mike Shirkey, the Republican Senate Majority Leader, early in the day had what we're calling a pre-buttal, a pre-response. Read a speech, took questions from the audience, and he was not having this unity theme. Now, this was before the speech, but he was like usual, normal Whitmer, everything against. Does this speech now all, again, unity change that message, or are Republicans still very like, no, Whitmer, we've got an election to win?
Well, Mike Shirkey as a human being can be difficult to read in regard to things like these. Writ large, the Republican pre-action or especially reaction was sort of ran the range from welcome aboard to she took our stuff. That, there were all of these ideas that Republicans had been, laying out, and they weren't necessarily doctrinaire conservative issues. They were, practical criminal justice reform. Even the earned income tax credit was, something that a lot of Republicans were on board with, and it was kind of like this. Unity, I guess, because this was not a fire-breathing, progressive leaning speech by any stretch. It was middle ground. It was, here are the areas of commonality. Now let's make it happen. And I think one of the most interesting things to me, and I look to Sergio and Emily to react to this as well, that it almost seemed like she set the stage for a tax cut fight over who can deliver the most tax quote relief unquote in the biggest way, that is also not something that the other side could get on board with. And I think the income tax would be the place where that would start.
Well, funny you should bring that up, Rick, because that is exactly where I want to jump to next, is tax credits.
You keep slipping cards under the door.
And tax credits and cuts. And I just wanted to also quickly reminder for everyone, we are already like 15 minutes in and just talking. So please put your questions into the chat. I'm already seeing some of them and I want to jump into them. But first, I want to dig into just the plethora of tax credits and cuts that were talked about last night, right? We're talking about the repeal of the very unpopular tax on pensions that was put into place under then Governor Rick Snyder, which Whitmer, as minority leader of Senate Democrats, was against. She called for an increase in the earned income tax credit, a rebate for electrical vehicle purchases. She also reminded folks about the $400 per vehicle rebate coming because of the auto insurance overhaul that we should note has left some catastrophically injured folks still without care and still does not have a fix in Lansing. But let's jump into this list. I mean, you could almost think is this a Republican giving this speech when it was talking about the economy? Emily, you have covered a number of Snyder State of the States, and now you're hearing Whitmer's. Were you sort of, I don't know if shocked is the word, but as like, whoa, is this a Republican or Democrat giving this speech?
Well, I do think that fundamentally she's selling something Republicans like, right? Tax cuts are something that Republicans generally support philosophically and have supported with their votes and bill introductions in the past. So I think that she does have that on her side. But in terms of like the specific proposals, I did think it was interesting that she changed the terminology around pension tax. Like she kept calling it a retirement tax. And I was just kind of like, are we calling it that? And I don't know if that was like an entree for
You didn't get the memo, Emily?
Well,
Remember when Republicans started calling it the pension tax, and it was like, oh,
well, and
won that messaging point.
I actually, we have a lot of funny names for taxes. I remember the birthday tax, but I do think that, even in her example that she gave of a family of a retired couple who had to unretire, like she didn't just mention pensions, she mentioned like 401ks and stuff. And I was sort of like, I wonder if this is some sort of entree or like negotiating starting point where she might be able to pull Republicans on, or maybe signaling that she's open to something broader or some type of negotiation. So that was one of my notes, I guess.
Sergio, what about your takeaways about tax cut fever?
You forgot to mention one, which is that the legislature is advancing lowering the corporate income tax as well. And so, if you add that one with,
and that's a wedge issue,
right? And if you add that and to all of the issues that you mentioned, I mean, we're truly talking about everyone is standing in the same room. They're talking to each other about the same thing, but you're going to see them like pulling to each side in the next few weeks and months to try to see, like you mentioned, like who delivers the biggest tax cut, whatever that means. Because at the end of the day, we don't know. And we talked to some experts last night after the speech, and they were saying, yeah, she said a lot of things that Republicans and Democrats agree on. Now the devil's in the details. Like we don't know what that's gonna mean in a week or 2 weeks. And today there's Whitmer is looks like she's saying yes, we can work on this together. But I don't know. In 2 months, maybe the story will be a little different.
Rick?
Well, when is the budget presentation? February
Usually the
6th?
second Wednesday. Yeah, February 6th, 7th. I think it's the second Wednesday in February.
Right, and that's very possibly when we will see where this plays out in a practical as opposed to a more metaphysical in a more metaphysical fashion, and people, including business lobbyists, that corporate tax cut is just really, really interesting, because that really sets the stage for are we going to be giving tax breaks to fat cats, or are we going to be giving tax breaks to working families around the kitchen table, and tax breaks for kitchen tables so that they have kitchen tables in order to figure out the tax breaks around.
He can't take you anywhere. I want to jump in just
take me far.
No, it's right. Can't take you to the den. So I want to get into a couple of questions. Richard says, post-speech pundits, which I guess that's you fools. Pundits observed that that Michigan has a budget surplus, largely due to one-time events. And the governor wants to spend that surplus as if it will be a reoccurring event. I mean, it is true, the amount of money that Michigan is sitting on right now, whether it is the general fund budget or still money from the federal government, is mind-blowing. Emily, I'm going to go back to you, remembering the Snyder years. Rick, of course, you as well. And Sergio, like, it was insane during Granholm and Snyder, the amount of money deficit that the state was in. I mean, we were talking $1 billion cuts at times, and now we're talking $15 billion to spend. Sergio, help us understand how that money, as Rick likes to call Biden bucks, has to actually go along with some of these tax cuts. Some of them are going to be from two pools of money.
Right. And so, with the state still has like over $7 billion on federal aid from the pandemic that the legislature and the governor has yet to spend. And we do know that the cities and counties are also expected to receive additional money. We're also waiting for the money from the infrastructure bill that's supposed to come throughout the next 5 years. So there's way too much money. Like there's a lot of money out there that when you have that amount, it's almost like the sky is the limit. You can do whatever you want with them. We know that with the pandemic relief dollars, there are some parameters. So the legislature has to follow those. I think that one of the things that I found interesting, Zoe, is that I didn't hear Whitmer talking specifics about how to spend a lot of this money, at least on the speech.
Right.
Like we didn't hear a lot of how she was planning on spending some of the money in terms of like the federal aid that we still have, or like the other aspects of the surplus. And I thought that was a good opportunity. She could have used that opportunity to push Republicans and have it out there on the record and see what Republicans had to respond. And she didn't do that. And so anyway, I was surprised to see that didn't happen, because that was a great way for her to, again, tell people we have all this money, this is my plan, and we can do this because the sky is the limit at this point.
She did have a little hint.
Yeah, I want to just really. Oh yeah.
Oh, she teased us
Go
on
ahead, Emily.
education. Did you guys catch
Right.
that? She sort of
Yes,
teased
yes,
us
and I
like,
love it.
we're going to make this 20-year historic investment.
The most
and
amount of increase in
Right.
Yes.
recent
But we
memory.
won't say
Yeah.
what it is, but also there will be a tax increase. So I do think some of that's playing out in February when we get to budget season.
Yes, of which
It
we
is,
should
although
say-
getting to Sergio's point, it was, I don't know if it would win you points for open government, but it was kind of a savvy tactic to drop the hint of it out there, but without starting to negotiate with yourself. I mean, it was almost, an invitation for Republicans to step out and say, here's what we want to see, that they actually, she puts out the idea, but they make the first offer.
Here's a question.
Yeah, well, I want to read a comment real quick from Bill, who says, "Esteemed panelists, thank you, Bill. That's very kind. Please comment on the governor's lack of addressing how Michigan can best capture the funding coming through the infrastructure law, especially broadband funding." Bill, this is exactly what we're talking about right now. This sort of again, just years and years of coverage about budget deficits. You have so much money. We talked about this in our last politics issues in AL2. Like so much money, folks are actually having trouble spending it, right? Because they don't actually have the infrastructure, pun intended, I guess, and the staff to be able to write the grants and actually write checks to send this out. I want to go to Renat, who says, "What happened to fix the roads?"
I have comments.
You are add damn into that too, Emily. Go ahead, jump in.
I won't. I'll spare the listening public. But obviously, that's a huge problem for Whitmer going into this cycle, or it was that she had ran on this pledge to fix the roads. She had sort of decided to go it alone once she couldn't get legislative involvement, but that only fixed state trunk lines. To be determined, but honestly, this federal influx could kind of bail her out of that, right? People are going to be seeing orange barrels all summer, if not on their way to the polls. I think it'll be a lot more believable to people that something substantial has been done about roads because of this influx of federal money. There's still a lot of details that are waiting to shake out, but honestly, I think Whitmer's got to be thanking her lucky stars that the feds came together on an infrastructure package right before she went back on the ballot. So,
and wishing that Republicans in the legislature would, bail her out by starting to appropriate some of this money. Although I want to circle back to broadband, because just the politics of that is really, really interesting. That the places that need high-speed internet upgrades the most are urban areas, urban centers, which are Democratic strongholds, and rural areas, which are Republican strongholds. And that is a huge negotiating opportunity, that when you are starting to disperse those funds, that you can call in Republicans who represent those rural areas and say, we're going to give you something, because people love to talk about, that everyone loves to talk about tax cuts. But when budgets are adopted and amendments go out, and you guys all know this because you get the same press releases in your emails that I do, is that they put out, that some place got $150,000 to add high-speed internet to their, to get to their local public library, and $150,000 in the massive pot that is the state budget is less than a raindrop. And so there's, like I said, that just leaves so much to work with, and that is a big opportunity to make friends.
I want to just say we're getting quite a few questions about redistricting, and Mr. Redistricting coverage himself, Sergio Martinez Beltran, is on this call specifically for that. So we are absolutely going to make time to talk about all things redistricting. I want to continue with the speech just for another couple minutes before we dig into sort of the election year that we find ourselves. Because Emily, you started to tease it about Whitmer teasing about just historic education funding. I mean, it's so fascinating that, we are still in the midst of COVID-19, right? Like the state, although it's looking like good news that we're starting to see the 7-day average cases starting to go down over the past week, hospitalizations the same. We were really not doing well with the Omicron variant when it came to hospitalizations. It felt like almost every single day we were hearing hospitals saying we are overwhelmed, we can't do this care. You didn't hear that necessarily in this speech, right? There was a thank you for the workers during COVID. But I mean, many times during this speech, I would say, what, do you think it's fair to say 2/3, 3/4? It almost felt like COVID wasn't even part of the conversation. How does that go over politically? I mean, I get the politics of not wanting to talk about how awful things are, but it's also like, what reality are we all living in right now?
Yeah, I mean, she's got a tough line to walk on COVID, because a lot of ardent Democrats who were with her on stay-at-home orders and who thoroughly praised her for saving lives sort of watched what she did during the most recent surge, which was sort of nothing. Like, I don't mean to say it like that. Like, obviously, like MDHHS was mobilizing. So there was some federal assistance requests that went in. But, in terms of like trying to change human behavior, the state's pretty much shifted to, hey, people should get vaccines. And if you look at those vaccination numbers, they are not moving, not moving swiftly in any case. At least over the past few weeks and months, really. But yeah.
But they weren't going to.
But I guess my question is, was this a missed opportunity, right? To do one more. Yeah, go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, I just feel like she can't remind people of her track record on COVID because it's changing, right? Like, she can't say, good job me saving all these lives, because, some of the DHHS's own data indicates that, some more restrictions during this surge could have saved lives, certainly saved more. So, I do think that she's walking a really tough line with keeping her really strong supporters in her first 2 years, being really strong supporters maybe in her second 2 years.
We also know
there's also. Go ahead, sir.
We also know that with schools, right? Education is a big issue as well, especially during the pandemic. And we heard her say, hey, we know that in-person learning is the best thing for students, and we're going to do whatever it takes to keep students in school, which, I think we have to also be a little fair here on the fact that the CDC guideline has evolved, right? And so what we had at the beginning, we can all remember when those 2 weeks, we were only going to be for 2 weeks in quarantine. We all stock up on wine and beer.
2 weeks to stop the spread.
Then, yes, and I went to Aldi and got some beers and wines just to survive for 2 weeks, and then it became 2 years. So it has clearly evolved. So I think we also have to be fair that just hearing the governor now say that about education, for example, saying we want to keep students in school, Sure, some people have been saying that all along, but she says she's following a policy or like CDC guideline. And so now we're hearing that. And we also know that at the end of the day, COVID fatigue is real. And even those who might have been like, yes, it's important to like stay at home, at this point in time are probably getting tired of that. And it's the reality she's facing.
Yeah.
There's a conundrum that the governor and public health leaders are facing in Michigan, and there's a divide over how exactly to handle this. And it's kind of, I say that it's, medical science versus political science or sociology, that we need more people to get vaccinated. We need people to respect the public health guidance from the CDC. And the people who are willing to do that, well, they're already doing it. I mean, there might be fatigue, but they're still doing it. And we're at the point, and I don't know if we're gaining or losing ground in this particular fight, where the state and the public health community has to reach the hardest to reach people, the most resistant people. And if you set down a rule that says you have to get vaccinated, you must wear a mask, you can't, but thou shalt, that they will resist, and they will resist hard. And so it's got to be the much slower moving persuasion route. And the problem is that there are sacrifices, difficult, tragic sacrifices that are made along the way if you take that route. But there are also difficult, tragic sacrifices that are made no matter which way you go. And right now, the social science that I'm aware of, at least, says that we're in the live with what we've got and persuade people to do the right thing stage.
Yeah. Do you guys think that COVID's just not a dinner table issue? Like, she's talking about dinner table issues, like in the way that she frames her campaign. And I wonder if COVID is just like not something you want to talk about at the dinner table, because it's not something that everybody feels the same way about at this point.
It's such a good question. And it's so hard to think about it, because it's like, right, I don't know that necessarily you prepare dinner, sit down and be like, so let's talk about the latest numbers. But the fact that you're sitting down every night, maybe with only your immediate family, or not going out to dinner and then a movie, right? It's like you're right. It's almost like we're not talking about it at the kitchen table, as Laura Weber Davis of Michigan Radio said. This was the kitchen table speech, but it's in the background, in the foreground, and over us and under us, in all of these cases. And if you've got kids in Flint, let's say, who aren't going into school, and they're at that dining room table like I am right now doing school, and then you're moving their schoolwork off to bring food to the dining room table, it's like it's there. But you're right. I mean, how much are we actually discussing it? Like, hey, so how's COVID treating you today? And I don't mean to be flip, but it's a great question, Emily.
Well, maybe we're not discussing it. It's kind of moved into the realm of micro decisions that we all keep masks by the door or in our cars, and then we drive to someplace, where we're going to go shopping, and we get out and we go into the store and we see that maybe some people are wearing masks, but a lot of people aren't wearing masks. And then we have to make the decision, are we going to be people who are masked, or are we going to be outliers in this situation? I know a decision that I make, but I'm aware of the fact that the decision is there and present. And we know that we're putting ourselves into a place where people are judging us based on it. I mean, I know that when Zoe and I go to the supermarket and that person is working really, really hard to, make the line move faster and get things bagged while wearing a mask, that we're going, thank you very much for what we're doing, because we know what a pain that is to have to do that job and wear a mask and keep it on, all at the same time. So we're kind of in these, mini decisions about, what's the most appropriate way to handle this particular situation when we step out of the house anywhere. And that includes public places, going to work at the state capitol and covering the legislature, or, even some family gatherings.
I have to give a quick shout out to our amazing, amazing stateside host, April Bear, who I didn't realize was out there. Hi, Bear, who says in all caps, "We do at my house," which I totally 100% believe. And I love your kitchen table, April Bear. I want to get into a couple of questions. Janet says, Zoe, you started to mention education and then veered to COVID. So true. Sorry, I got distracted by this question in my head about wanting to talk a little bit about why we didn't talk more about COVID or why the governor didn't talk more about COVID in her speech. But you want more details about education. So she says, crystal ball about sustainable funding and maybe some thoughts about testing and curriculum. So again, we've talked about this one-time funding, right? That either because we have a surplus or because from federal money that she's able basically to say, we're going to have a historic increase in education funding. But is that sustainable?
I just want to do a quick poll. Has anyone ever covered an increase in education funding that whoever was proposing did not call historic? Because I think I've covered like 25 historic education funding.
There was that time it never happened.
And Rick is old enough to remember.
Never.
Yeah, I mean,
I remember Proposal A.
I really do want to see the number here, though, because it's going to reach historic levels if you put $5 at it at this point, right? Like we have continued to put a lot of money toward education, and I think that reflects our priorities as a state. But I do kind of want to see some specifics, and to the point about one-time versus ongoing funding, I would say that school aid fund in general is a pretty rosy picture, even outside of the federal influx that I'm sure will fund some of her plan. So it's possible that we could sort of use some of that federal influx to get schools to a level that we can sustain later on, because the fund is getting rosier and rosier as the years go on.
I'm also curious to see how, because when we talk about education, at least last night, she also talked from a little bit more comprehensive. She talked about counselors and mental health experts and other folks who can support students. And I'm wondering, how is that going to be funded, right? Because if it's a one-time payment, that's it. You can do it for maybe 1 or 2 years, but that would be it. And then you will have the same decrease or the lack of those professionals in the schools. And so it's going to be interesting, because I think mental health, especially after the Oxford tragedy, has brought a lot of people together, and we have a special task force on school safety that is looking into mental health proposals. We know that the governor is talking about the same thing. Senate Majority Leader Mike Shirkey has also talked about mental health. So it's almost like tax relief, right? Mental health was mentioned a lot and has been mentioned a lot. What's going to be interesting is how can we use, or what type of funding we're going to use to actually accomplish something there, which is
also
needed.
How it's going to be used, because the big controversy in mental health is everyone's talking about mental health. It's really important, but privatization is is how are we going to deliver those services, and how much of those services are going to be delivered in a public setting, or how much of it is going to be done through privately funded community mental health services. And and that particular controversy, like so many of the ones that we're talking about, has been around for decades. And what is the responsibility to which people and how it should be carried out? That's big and complex. It's not like, hey, we've ignored this for too long and now we're finally going to fix it. It goes in fits and starts, but it's not like people have not been talking about it, and it's not like there are not existential differences in terms of what it means to deliver quality mental health services. And that's what and that's what we're going to be covering in the coming months.
Personnel wise, I know the cost of everything is going up, but we've also been talking a lot about a teacher shortage. There is a recruitment and retention problem with teachers right now. I wouldn't be surprised if part of that money making it toward classrooms is actually compensating teachers at a different level than we've seen historically.
And that's exactly what I was just going to ask. I mean, we're talking about mental health services for kids who are struggling. I mean, we are going on 3 years of a full year of school, because of course, for so many, school changed in March of 2020, and here we are, 2 full, years later. There's, getting mental health services, counseling, wraparound services to students, but then there's the issue of just staffing. Right. And like, how do you get teachers to want to do, in some ways, what can feel like a really thankless job these days? So again, the second week in February, we will be covering the governor's budget. And we should really be clear. We keep calling it the governor's budget. It is her budget. It is her budget proposal. This is how things work. You get the state of the state, or well, first it's the consensus revenue estimating conference. Then it's the state of the state. Then it's the budget, but this is just her proposal.
And then it's the next consensus revenue estimating conference.
Right. But it's not like she just gets to say so here's how things are going to be. And then, magically it happens. And to our point earlier, this will be probably what, and supplemental budgets like that will be what we'll be watching for, 4 months to come. Meanwhile, of course, lawmakers are going to want to be in district over the summer because we are in an election year. So let's start at the top of the ballot. Everyone sort of said this was, the beginning last night of governor's, re-election campaign, that in some ways it sounded like a re-election address. Some Republicans cheekily kept calling it, the best last state of the state address they had ever heard, Emily, give us sort of a state of the gubernatorial campaign of where we're at right now on January 27th, 2022.
I still feel like the Republican side of the ballot is the wild, wild west right now. I think we just saw another candidate happen today, another sort of businessman outsider type person. But yeah, I mean, there are 12, like a baker's dozen is 13, an even dozen candidates.
One full dozen.
One full dozen. I'm not going to rule out a baker's dozen, by the way. I feel like people keep joining, so leaving that door open. But honestly, it's nobody's really carved out a lane that looks like the clear front runner yet, in my opinion. I know that James Craig has sort of been billed as the front runner a lot. I'm not sure that that's based in fact, to be honest with you. I think that I think that he obviously is a strong contender. I think there are a lot of strong contenders. Frankly, he's not who I'm hearing about from my friends and relatives at family birthday parties. I don't know about the rest of your experience. But I think that people are sort of talking about a lot of candidates right now. And frankly, the Trump factor is just hanging out there. Mm-hmm. That could sway the race. I really, really think that Trump coming in and endorsing somebody could sway the race in a lot of ways. I think that some people might drop out if that happened. I think there are people who are vying for that endorsement.
It would make a huge difference. Although, Emily, and I don't mean this to be cheeky, but when you go to family gatherings, are people talking about any candidates for governor?
Okay, that's true. They're probably just being nice to me. Like, oh, what do you think?
And Emily's like, well, let me tell you everything.
No, I will say organically, just in my life and also in a couple of yard sign situations, I've heard a lot about Garrett Soldano. He's the chiropractor from the Kalamazoo area. He is sort of trying to carve out an alternative lane. He was the one who held the big rally outside
of Mackinac Island.
Yes, outside of the traditional Mackinac conference. But honestly, I think it's a wide open field. I think that people are still trying to sort of carve out where they fit into this race and, sort of what part they play and who's their foil still. And there's so many opportunities that I really don't think that there's I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that anyone's going to pull it out at this point.
Yeah,
they're so different too.
John wants to know thoughts on Chief Craig's chances. I mean, I think it's fair to say that early on it was sort of this idea it was going to be an anointment of the primary come August, and it just appears like it's not. In fact, Chief Craig went to Florida looking for the Trump endorsement and came back empty-handed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I keep thinking about during the Mackinac policy, the Mackinac policy conference, that the candidates were having like a chance to like speak from the stage for the Republican one, and literally the leadership of the Michigan GOP only went to like an event from James Craig. And when you asked Tudor Dixon and the other candidates, hey, have they showed up, right? They were like, no, they didn't show up to my event. So at that point, I think it was kind of clear that there is this preference, and that at least like those establishment types were following Craig. But I do think about their chances or his chances, like Emily said, I think it might be a wild card. I was at Kevin Rinke's event, campaign event last week, where he launched his campaign, and that was interesting. It was not super packed, but he was not talking about policy. He was talking about the same Republican talking points that other candidates are. But I've heard there's some enthusiasm around him because he is almost like Glenn Youngkin from Virginia, or he's trying to position himself like one. And then you have Garrett Soldano, which, I think many people have dismissed him since the beginning because of his beliefs. But I do think he has something that excites a certain group of people that might be needed to win the nomination. And, we should not be dismissing him. I think we should be paying attention to him as well, because he excites people. I think James Craig excites some people, but I don't know, his background, right? He used to be a Democrat. He admits that. And so in an era where if you were a Democrat or had any ties with Democrats or even vote with Democrats, you are a rhino. It's going to be interesting how those hardcore Republicans, feel about that.
James Craig fit the template that had been set up by some Republican poobahs, former Governor John Engler, Party Chair Ron Weiser, as someone who checked a lot of boxes: African American, Detroit, law enforcement, who could pose a credible threat to the reelection of Gretchen Whitmer. And the problem is, first of all, his rollout was a disaster. That no one was talking about James Craig and what he brought to the race. People were talking about James Craig and the rolling screw up that his announcement was. So it was a bad start. And you can say that it's okay, just insiders are talking about that, but that's how outsiders start paying attention. So the fact that wasn't the steamroller that I think some insiders were expecting it to be, meant that left a lot of openings for others to jump in, especially absent that just in the current Republican Party, that critical endorsement from former President Donald Trump that would make a difference with the party base. Although as time goes on, it does seem like there is a sector of the Republican Party, maybe not gubernatorial candidates, but lower down on the ticket, who are wondering, well, just how much do I want to, as time goes on, be associated with that branch of the Republican Party?
Well, that's what's going to be so interesting, right, in the August primary. And in some respects, I mean, that's how we ended up with a Governor Rick Snyder.
That's exactly how we ended up.
Yeah.
I mean, many of these folks are like logistically on the ballot, right? But I mean, if the vote splits 12 ways, someone could win with like 15% or something, right? Right. It has the potential to be pretty wild.
Yeah, and that's how Rick Snyder won. That there were three, conservative Republicans. There was Mike Cox, Bouchard, Pete Hoekstra, and Snyder ended up coming out. And so let's see how many are actually, on the ballot come August. Speaking of ballots, Emily, we were talking about the dozen candidates for governor. Is it fair to say there's like a baker's dozen of petition drives out there right now in some state or another? Tell us the ones that you and your team are focusing on the most right now, whether they are actually out in the field or, just like we're hearing about them originally. And what then, of course, I want to talk about that could mean for turnout in a midterm election.
Yeah, I would say like the topic area grouping is sort of these ones around voting. That's sort of a hot topic nationally. There's a lot of legislative moves on voting nationally, and obviously some that have either been done or attempted here in Michigan. I guess it gets kind of meta when I talk about watching a citizens initiative where people will vote on how to vote. But that is sort of
blown, man.
What's dominating my headspace right now.
Sergio, what about you? What petitions are you keeping an eye on leading up to November?
Yeah, I think the secure my vote petition, that's the big one because of the impact it would have on our election system if they were to be passed. And I think, in reality, we're paying attention to those that are already collecting signatures, because we do know, which it blows my mind as someone who is like newish to the state, is the fact that, they could actually become law if the legislature embraced them and votes for them, So I think that at this point, those petitions that are out there and that are those groups that are collecting signatures, they have a chance with the Republican majority, which is, at the end of the day, a bunch of these petitions are Republican aligned. So, I mean, we're paying attention to the secure my vote. There's others that could come out soon. We know that there's a petition that would make the state do an audit once again of the 2020 election. And, it would create this grand jury and this panel of 20 Republicans and Democrats to decide whether there was fraud or any issues with the elections. And that is significant. And, it still needs the final approval. But if that's one that goes out again, there is a lot of Republicans who still have a lot of appetite to do this again. And so they could be successful.
Rick, you've also been following some abortion rights initiatives that also are trying to go out into the field. And a lot of this has to do with the possibility of what could be a really historic in nature Supreme Court decision that would basically overturn Roe v. Wade. And Michigan has a law, I think it's from 1931, in place that if we're early 30s, that if Roe v. Wade was overturned, Michigan abortion is illegal in this state. If that was able to get enough signatures, obviously the legislature, because it is Republicanly controlled, would not approve it, which is how these things go in petitions, and it would go to the ballot. I mean, you have to assume that would help turn out for Democrats.
I think it would help turn out all the way, all the way around. That, as a matter of fact, I mean, one of the interesting things, Right to Life of Michigan, which is the state's premier group that opposes abortion rights, used to be pretty much the most powerful lobbying group in the state capitol when there was still sort of room to push to the top of the limits of Roe v. Wade, and they would do a ballot drive every few years just to refresh their voter lists, because that is what they used to lobby the legislature regarding abortion restrictions and also things like assisted suicide. That wasn't strictly abortion.
Yeah.
But I mean, this could be a refresher recruitment effort for anti-abortion groups, for pro-choice groups, who are all looking to align themselves to make the adjustment if the Supreme Court does in fact take that step.
Emily, you made a face when I said being helpful for Democrats. I want to dig into that. It feels to me like, so Republicans pretty much turn out, like we know Republicans usually turn out more in midterms than Democrats do, right? Like I feel like that's no, like I
don't
feel
know.
like
I have to think about it.
Yeah, no. Yeah, it's this thing where like we always feel like Democrats during presidential elections turn out, and then it's sort of ebbs in midterms. Now in 2018, that was very different, right? And especially sort of the blue wave or the pink wave, what you want to call it, in 2018 in Michigan. So I mean, is it a wash then in something like this? Like, do you have Republicans who would turn out anyway, turn out for this petition drive? But are there folks who don't normally turn out to vote necessarily, but believe so much in a woman's right to choose that they do turn out. I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out in my head.
I guess I absolutely think that on both sides of the aisle and on both sides of this issue, there are single issue voters who this would be like the single animating thing bringing them to the ballot box. So I don't know how that washes out, but I certainly don't see it as like a Democratic advantage.
Well, I'm thinking back to like Shirley Johnson, who retired as the Senate Appropriations Chair when she was a Republican. And throughout her career from the House all the way into the Senate, she was ardently pro-choice. It's just in the Republican caucus, it didn't matter because, you know, there was Roe v. Wade. So it was possible it was reasonable for people who were pro-choice to make alliance with people who were pro-life on all kinds of issues and support them in election and re-election campaigns and stuff like that, because it was settled jurisprudence.
Yeah.
And if it's not, then that just, you know, all the pieces in the board go up in the air.
Yeah. I think February 11th is the next Board of State Canvassers meeting. So we'll see what new shenanigans come to them on that day. Okay. Long awaited. Let's jump in to all things redistricting. Sergio, fill us in. Just today, there were big headlines, but can you just first give us kind of like the broad overview? Maps have been approved, but they are in front of just fill us all in. We're gonna mute ourselves, sit back,
let me drink water real quick.
Listen to you. You take us.
You deserve better than water.
Take a deep breath.
I know. I'm like, well, I feel great about this because you know, the maps are approved. So my fear was that I had learned so much about redistricting, and then suddenly my brain is occupied with this information that I won't be able to share. So, you know, maps were approved on December 28th. And truly they were supported in a bipartisan manner. Now, it's important to know that there's 13 members of the Redistricting Commission, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 5 independents. And in order for maps to be approved, you needed at least 2 of each party affiliation and 2 independent commissioners. And these maps were like overwhelmingly supported by commissioners. So, you know, contrary to other redistricting commissions in the country where we're imploding within or imploded from within, the Michigan Redistricting Commission was doing pretty good. Now, there have already been 2 challenges. So there's 2 lawsuits pending against the commission. One was brought by the Detroit caucus, who actually the Michigan Supreme Court heard the case yesterday for oral arguments. And then we learned hours after that hearing that the general counsel of the Redistricting Commission had abruptly quit. And it is a big news because the general counsel's role is to coordinate the legal strategy of the Redistricting Commission on behalf of the commission. And so there are 2 pending lawsuits against the commission, and then the top lawyers has said that her last day will be in February. So I think the commission is in a really bad place. You know, we wrote a story about it today, and the first line was, it's been quite a week for the Redistricting Commission because they lost their attorney yesterday. And then today, the commission, again, like they have fulfilled their duty. Like they already drew their maps, and today they met to discuss administrative items. And then suddenly it became this thing where one of the Republican commissioners accused the chair of bullying, of mistreatment. There was a motion to censure that chair. And you can still see the bickering between like commissioners. So it's suddenly all this like experimenting democracy and love suddenly has become this weird situation where there's a lot of infighting. But, you know, with these lawsuits, which I think it's an important part here, I saw a question in the chat that was asking about how these maps would impact the candidates on this next election. Well, if the maps become law, which they're expected to happen around March, the new candidates would use the new districts. And so it would have a direct impact. However, with these two lawsuits, the plaintiffs are asking the courts to order the commission to redraw the districts. And so if the courts were to side with the plaintiffs, I think all those deadlines will be shifting around, and we could potentially, depending how it plays out, worst come to worst, we would have to use the old maps and then use the new maps in the next election. Was that good? Was that like summarized?
Yes, beautifully done. You deserve an absolute drink after that one. Yeah, go ahead, Rick.
I am part of a group of state capitol bureau chiefs, a public radio state capitol bureau chiefs from all around the country, and it's
the nerdiest group there ever was.
We have fun, and it's coordinated by an editor at NPR, and I think it was a couple of weeks ago that we came in and the top agenda item was, well, let's talk about redistricting, especially redistricting commissions. And the group chief, the NPR coordinator and Michigan is being portrayed as the state that's done it right, that this is the model that everyone else is going to follow. And I said, by who? No one who's paying attention to how it's working here. And then we had a long discussion about how it's actually working here. And people were truly astonished to find out just what a hot mess it really is. Now, redistricting, to be fair, redistricting is never pretty and it's never easy. It always winds up in court in some way, shape, or form. I think this is my third redistricting cycle, and it just always gets ugly. But this is certainly not the kumbaya, voters in charge process we could all believe in that that people expected it was going to.
Let me push back on that, and I think this has been sort of the debate that's been going on, which people were really thrilled to have it sign on. More than 60% of voters in 2018 decided, with voters not politicians, that they wanted to take the politicians out of drawing the map. Maybe there was a sense, me included, I think, right, that it would be a relatively smooth. I don't know that I thought much about it, truthfully. When we were covering it, it was just so much about will it or will it not pass, and what would that look like, and take it out of the hands. But when you sit back and actually look at it, 13 people, Republicans, Democrats, from no political background coming together. Sure, it's messy. I guess I don't want to say shame on all of us, but shouldn't we have sort of been oh yeah, this could be a cluster? Yeah.
Who told you?
Okay, Emily, go ahead.
Who told you? The issue there is that with voters, not politicians, people were not generally voting for what they wanted. They were voting against what they didn't want, which is they didn't want politicians, elected officials, drawing their own districts, making deals with other elected officials about the districts that they were going to run in. That they knew that didn't work. What they had to do was construct a system that they thought would work. And, it ain't that pretty, but if it were easy to do, it would have been done a long, long time ago. Somewhere.
Yeah,
Emily,
I would just say that the commission did conduct the most transparent process in Michigan history. However, let's remind ourselves that's an extraordinarily low bar. Basically, basically anything other than
you
a
think
closed
someone
door,
would manage it like
smoke-filled
that?
room. Well, really, it used to happen behind closed doors, really. And
let's make it look this way. Well, the redistricting classically, when it was in the legislature, was a pretty shameless process as well.
Yeah, for sure. But I do think that I'm not sure they lived up to that low bar. Certainly, I'm not sure they lived up to the ideals of the commission that the people were voting for. Certainly, they didn't live up to the constitutional requirement that they have open meetings. They've gone into closed session multiple times now.
Absolutely.
I think that. Just to add something real quick,
Please.
Zoe, I think that I also, every time I talk redistricting and, what happened and like look back, I always like to bring up, the fact that the people being affected. I mean, we're talking about real life people, right? And I think that we have to pay attention to the African American voters who
Yes.
have said that the way these districts are drawn dilute their voting power. And, I think that the commission says we have experts that have told us that the way we have created the districts or the new maps truly give African American voters more opportunities to have an influence in other districts. And then you have African American leaders, and I'm not talking about the Black lawmakers who clearly have a horse in this race, right? And clearly have some special interest here. I'm talking about real life voters who have this real concern because representation matters, and they are afraid that maybe now their candidate will be a Democrat, but it might be a white Democrat, which might not represent the same interest as the Black electorate. And, I think when Black voters in particular voted for this amendment, they were thinking that, this is going to be good. This is going to give us more power. And it's interesting to see that now we have a bunch of, we have discontent among the Black community, especially in Southeast Michigan, and because of the way the commission drew districts. And I always want to remind people, again, redistricting is a political process. It's messy, it's chaotic, but it has real life impacts on everyday people, and we have to keep reminding ourselves of that.
Well, and seeing the retirement of Brenda Lawrence, of Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, right? Michigan's only Black member of the congressional delegation is an indication of that. Go ahead, Rick.
I was going to say, and it's not as mathematical as it's portrayed. It's a lot of numbers, but there's even some guesswork. And I mean, what we're kind of seeing here is a sort of trying to figure out a power equation. Is two guaranteed, and I'm making up these numbers, but is two guaranteed majority minority seats where you're going to get an African American or two African Americans elected to Congress better or worse than 4 possible seats in minority seats in Congress?
Well, to Steve, I want to read from Stephen, who to Emily's point about the lowest threshold but meeting it. Stephen says, I voted for the ballot initiative on the theory that anything was better than what we had. And I think it has been better than what it used to be. Lisa says, at least this time we saw the process and had a voice. She says a Democrat from Midland.
I've thought that many times.
Right. And then Catherine says, I completely agree with Stephen. How could this be worse than the past? It reminds me a little bit of Monty Python, not dead yet.
Well, and we should point. The process will almost certainly be different again in 10 years. One, because it's always, every redistricting process is different, and the fact that this particular process is loud and messy and embarrassing, and it is all of those things. Is also, something because it's never been tried before. And, it may be that, people, I probably won't be doing it, but Serio, it might be under court order because you have to, but, he might be still covering it. That joke bombed.
Hopefully not. Please
just
say
went
that.
over all of our heads.
Because it was too good. But that we could see pieces being produced in 10 years that will be doing a compare and contrast, where it'll be the first time around this was a disaster and court fights and blah blah.
Let's also not forget this
and
first time around.
It'll be this was and this will be and this was so quiet in comparison to that.
Well, and this has all been done virtual. I mean, let's
Very
also
true. Excellent
put
point.
that reminder too. These, folks are doing this all virtually, which it's hard. Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting.
Do you sort of feel like the commissioners were like handed the Constitution and like had to assemble a piece of IKEA furniture with words only? And like now we've given them a picture. Like in 10 years, they'll at least know what this object is that they're trying to assemble, right?
No, I don't, because the fact is that they also were able to deal with an IKEA expert. It was just behind closed doors.
Yeah, that's how Rick and I decided we could finally get married, was when we were able to put a piece of IKEA furniture together. And it was like, if you can do that, you could do anything.
Did you play a part in that, really?
They did at some point met in person to actually start drawing the lines.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to mention though that most of it was via Zoom, and also like these people had never drawn a single map line in their lives, and I mean, literally, there were people like learning how to use mapping softwares, which they're sophisticated and they're complicated, and they were learning how to use a computer, like a state-issued computer as well. So, the learning curve for this commission was huge, and I think we should expect the same learning curve for the next commission, because it's a group of random people, right, that are not involved in this political process. And my other point here is that, again, this is predictive work. Like we're making predictions here, and so I think what's going to be fascinating is like if we were to use the new maps in the next election, it's going to be interesting to see who wins and like how competitive the Democratic primary or the general elections are, because we truly have not run a single election in those districts yet.
Yeah.
Right. Sergio, I have a question for you. I've been meaning to ask you, and just, this is the opportunity. Because one of the issues with this is that we had commissioners who were sort of freelancing and outside of the meetings, drawing their own districts and trying this and that. Did you get the sense from dealing with the commissioners that map drawing had become kind of their hobby?
Yeah,
and
like long walks on the beach and map drawing.
No, yeah, I think legitimately the commitment from these people, like they were drawing lines in the weekends. Also, the commitment from the press corps who covered this. We were also drawing lines to try to understand the system. but yeah, they were working on the weekends. They were working until late, drawing their own lines, and they were helping each other too, because again, it is complicated, and it is a sophisticated software that not everyone has access to. So I think they were truly committed and they had really good intentions. I think the fact, I think the way the constitutional amendment was written, which was vague at times and didn't give a lot of, and it didn't empower the commission to do many things that they wanted to do. And also, just like the fact that they were naive, they've never done this, played a huge role too in the work product that we have now.
Well, let's finally
and it's going to be the new Dungeons and Dragons. Is going to be there are going to be these Society for Creative Anachronism groups that are going to be getting up and like, draw your own district lines.
I'll probably be there.
I was like, and what?
Well, you could be a district master.
As we wrap up, I want to go to Lawrence, who asked a really interesting question. Do you envision the new redistricting maps impacting the legislative session right now, even before the next elections? Like, Emily, we always know that an election year impacts everything. Although, like, I love when politicians are like, I'm just trying to get the job done today. It's like, but how much on top of just that it being an election year is the fact that these new redistricting maps are happening too, playing a part into, all the sauce that's happening right now?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think there's some interpersonal like things where people would have been lumped into the same districts. People are trying to figure out if they want to move, which is a little bit bigger of a deal than on the congressional level, although I realize people are moving on the congressional level as well. But yeah, I mean, I do think that the legislature was watching this process pretty closely. It wasn't something that they talked about necessarily a lot. And I do think that they're very careful to say that they're focused on the present. And frankly believe that most of their time goes to the present. But, especially in an era of term limits, and especially in an era where House members are getting elected every 2 years, they are looking ahead. They have to be looking ahead. And as a self-preservation technique, I think that they're probably paying pretty close attention and could make political decisions based on what districts they've landed in.
Rick, do you want to quickly, before we wrap, tell that great story about years ago, back in the olden days, when the maps first came out, when there wasn't even the internet?
It is a Tim Skubic story.
Okay.
And it used to be.
Who we should say is the host of Off the
Record, and he's the dean of Capital Correspondence.
Which I should wait really quick, and I think Emily and Rick, are you both on tomorrow? Yeah.
Oh,
so
okay.
Watch on your local PBS stations. Anyway, go ahead, tell the story.
As I said, redistricting always goes to court. And in this particular year, it had gone to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court chose a retired judge that they called a special master, who was in charge of drawing all the new district lines. And because this was before the internet, it was just printed out on giant sheets of paper, and you had to go to the court to get them, and you had to pay for them. And so Tim went and actually paid for something himself, which is not Tim's style, and got the maps. I did the same thing. I went down and I wrote a check from my news organization. I was a newspaper reporter back then, got the maps, but I followed Tim. Tim walked out onto the floor of the State House of Representatives while it was in session. It's the largest room in the building, and there's a huge aisle, people who are familiar with it, that runs up the center from the door up to the speaker's rostrum. Tim walked up to the edge of where sort of journalists could go, and took his maps, his house maps, and flung them into the center aisle, where they just kind of rolled out, and lawmakers just jumped on them.
It was the first time the lawmakers were seeing the maps.
Right. And you could hear the paper thrashing, and the people were just yelling and looking, and there was words that you could not play on the radio. And Tim threw them out into the middle of the aisle, and just took out his microphone and put it into the middle of the mix, and took in the reaction. And my first thought was, what a shtick, how craven, how utterly brilliant.
That's amazing.
I hope it set the scene, because it was an amazing thing to witness.
Okay. Well, we are 285 days away from election 2022. I really, really hope that you will continue to follow Emily Lawler and her entire team at MLive, Sergio Martinez Beltran, who is really just like you came to Michigan this year from and you're circling laps around half of us. So please do everything to follow Bridge Michigan, doing absolutely incredible work. And
amazing
Rick
work.
Buda, who he's okay in my book.
I show up.
He shows up. You can always listen to on public radio, and all of these various dates that we've talked about in this year, and election coverage, of course, coming up. And again, I said it at the beginning, but I really mean it. I'm really grateful to all of you who are doing the work day in and day out, keeping transparency alive. It can be really hard work over the past years, particularly the past couple of years with COVID. And I'm just, as a viewer, as a listener, and a reader, I'm really, really grateful to all of you. And to everyone on tonight, thank you so much for sticking with us. You put the nerd in public radio for sticking with us for this conversation. Comments and questions were so good.
Next Dishes Nails is about spelling. Put the nerd in public radio. And we need to stay on, because it's going to get awkward.
We're really looking forward to getting to do these in person too. Again, the virtual ones are nice. Everyone you can't see is in their PJ pants underneath this, but really miss the in-person ones. I can't wait to buy everybody a beer at the next one. So good night, everybody. Thank you so much. Bye.